Hello and welcome to this video on treating starvation. You may think that the treatment for starvation is food, but no. Simply giving a person who was until shortly before starving is going to end very badly. The condition is called refeeding syndrome. Refeeding syndrome happens when somebody who is malnourished, generally for an extended period, begins to eat again. The reintroduction of all the necessities of life, whether that is things like sugar, proteins and similar, causes a raft of complications. The body begins to metabolize the food that they're consuming, and this shift results in both hormonal and electrolyte imbalances. These can then create some very nasty complications leading to death. Now that you're suitably depressed from that news, let's explain what happens and then how it's fixed. After up to 7 days, although sometimes more or less, the ability to metabolize food is compromised, and this is simply because the body is going into survival mode. It's recognized that there's a lack of things like glucose for energy and other necessities for life. Therefore, it begins to produce hormones in response to this. Primarily two. One is the reduction in insulin. The second is an increase in glucagon. Insulin is what the body uses to tell it to use reserves or free-floating glucose. The glucagon is what the body expresses to make it produce glucose from available reserves, whether that is fat or by converting things like amino acids into some sort of usable energy source. This is done when the body doesn't have enough carbohydrates. First it uses fat reserves and then proteins. The body gradually builds up its stockpile, or at least short-term stockpile, of glucose and other sources of energy this way. However, it is a short-term solution. You will eventually run out of fat and proteins that are available. When that happens, the body begins to break itself down. It will literally consume the muscles that make you up. This results in a huge change in the balance of electrolytes within the body. There's also a huge issue with vitamins, and the stores of those get used up very quickly. The important examples for this are potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, and thiamine. The first four being elements or nutrients, the last being a vitamin. Refeeding is intended to resolve the obvious and immediate issue of not having the necessary energy going into the body. Again, primarily focusing on glucose, but you can use more complex carbohydrates under the right circumstances. When you reintroduce these into the body, the glucose is going to be the very first problem. The body starts to produce insulin, and it tells the various parts of the body, but primarily thinking here of skeletal muscle and liver, to store that extra glucose in there for use later. This results in the absorption of various electrolytes at the same time. Phosphorus and sodium are good examples of this, although the phosphorus is more important in this context, as phosphorus is used to make ATP, which is the ATP is basically how the cell uses energy, but not the body as a whole. Because you now have a huge movement in electrolytes, primarily into cells, you get what is called hypophosphatemia, hypo too little, and phosphor being, phosphorus, and tema meaning too little. This is basically phosphorus deficiency. It is basically caused by the body moving various things around, but primarily focusing on glucose, in an effort to use up what is available. Again though, there are at least 3 other elements and a nutrient, primarily potassium, magnesium, calcium, and thiamine, that are also affected by this. Phosphorus is important in all parts of the body, but the areas that are going to be especially important are your heart, lungs, blood, and nervous system. If you can't deal with this, it will lead to death. The first signs and symptoms that are going to show up will be things like confusion, seizures, and muscle breakdown. Then you're going to get neuromuscular problems, and finally heart failure. This happens when you have hypophosphatemia. If that's not the cause, but rather a lack of magnesium, which is hypomagnesemia, this is indicated by low levels of calcium, potassium, weakness, fatigue, nausea, and then eventually abnormal heart rhythms. If potassium levels get too low, you have fatigue, weakness, excessive urination, breathing problems, heart problems, and eventually paralysis leading to death. All of these are fairly specialized, but All of the mentioned conditions so far tend to have associated with hypoglycemia, which is high blood sugar levels. Interestingly enough, specific to starvation, rather than something like, say, diabetes. There's some fairly obvious mental problems, as we've mentioned that is a pretty much generic symptom of all of these. You're going to have serum levels that are off the charts in some ways. You're going to have issues with fluid retention and muscle weakness. Again, by playing with the electrolyte balance in the body, you're going to be causing hell for the kidneys, which try to maintain fluid balance in the body. The risk for this is going to be most pronounced in those with a low body mass index, so we are talking about either dieting issues or starvation here. The refeeding process is something that can carry risks, but other than the low body mass index measurement, children and those who are frail or elderly tend to be most at risk of these side effects. A generic guide for this is that if a BMI of less than 16 is present, someone's lost more than 15% of their body weight in the last 3 to 6 months, that they haven't consumed food for the last 10 days, or they have low serum levels of the various elements we've mentioned, they are at much higher risk of developing refeeding syndrome. There's also risk for those with a BMI less than 18.5, losing more than 10% of their body weight over the same time frame, no food in the last 5 days, and have a history of things like alcohol or drug abuse. Anyone who is in one of these categories, or there is concern for other reasons, is at risk of refeeding syndrome, and generally speaking, doctors should take greater care with it. In order to treat starvation then, you don't just jump in and start feeding someone. Rather, you gradually work your way back to a normal level of food intake. This will ensure that electrolyte levels are maintained and that the hormones that are released as a result do not cause a lot of problems. It's nearly universal that extra or excess electrolytes are given intravenously. This is then something that the body can remove without an issue. By adding vitamins such as thiamine, it can also help with the absorption and utilization of these vitamins, nutrients, minerals, and so on. It ensures that the GI tract can absorb things like iron. This is continued until the electrolyte levels are stabilized. This is important, as stabilization doesn't occur over a day or two. It may take up to a week to achieve. By slowing down the feeding process and ensuring that small amounts are gradually built up, recovery and adjustment is much more likely to result in a favorable outcome and not death. The person who has experienced this will need continual observation and monitoring of their blood levels for things like electrolytes and other items. Sometimes the test of urine and blood will also happen as a whole to see what's going on. From a historical perspective, this is interesting as a lot of evidence really only starts to show up in the literature in the early to mid-1940s. People released from camps or Japanese captivity, where they experienced conditions that were like this and an interest was taken. Unfortunately, for many of these people, there wasn't any knowledge at the time and they were treated as people thought was best, which is in some cases to give them a very rich soup, for instance. Unfortunately, that did not end well for them. This is why knowledge of how to treat starvation is important. Doing it wrong is just as bad and as dangerous as not doing anything at all. This is because the body does not react well to huge swings in conditions. For example, going from starvation to a feast. It just doesn't work that way, and by not knowing how to deal with it appropriately, you can create more problems than you want to fix just by trying to do the right thing and be a good person. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.